Welcome everyone, our live audience and online viewers, to the live science seminar titled Improving the Quantification of Agricultural Greenhouse Gases in Low-Income Countries. My name is Meryl Richards and I work for the CGIAR research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security. The live stream seminar today is part of an ongoing series of live stream seminars by CCAFs, and it's organized with the support of Aarhus University at Fulum. We're here at Aarhus today at Fulum because we're beginning the kickoff workshop of the Climate Food and Farming Network. CLIF, the Climate Food and Farming Network, is an initiative of CCAFs, the University of Copenhagen, and Aarhus University to support young scientists who are working on issues related to climate change and agriculture. All of our grant recipients this year are in the live audience with us today. Today's presenter is Todd Rosenstock. Todd is an environmental impact scientist at the World Agroforestry Center. His research focuses on the synergies and trade-offs between soil health, agricultural production, and livelihoods at multiple scales, including climate change. Todd holds a PhD in agroecology from the University of California, Davis, and an MS in international agricultural development, also from UC Davis. Todd co-leads the Standard Assessment of Mitigation Potentials and Livelihoods in Smallholder Systems project, on which he'll be presenting today. We'll start with a 30-minute presentation from Todd, and then move into a 30-minute discussion section. During the seminar, our online viewers can type in questions and comments on the chat box, which you can find beneath your browser window on the CCAF's website. We strongly encourage you to debate the presentation while it's going on and also during the discussion session afterwards. Misha will be representing the online audience, and I'll make sure that the discussion represents both our live and online questions. With that, over to you, Todd. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Meryl, and thank you for the gracious introduction. And so, as Meryl suggested, I'm going to be talking today about the program Samples. This is the Standard Assessment of Mitigation Potential and Livelihoods in Smallholder Systems. And specifically, as part of that project, we are trying to improve the quantification of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, mostly in low-income countries. Samples is a multi-institutional project, and you can see many of the partners listed and many of the lead scientists listed on this title slide as well. So with that. So in 2009, I'm sure many of us in the audience are familiar with, Johan Rockström and colleagues put out this figure and this paper, and where they suggested that there were sort of nonlinear feedbacks within different Earth systems, and those nonlinear feedbacks had sort of thresholds, and within those thresholds, if we cross those thresholds, that we would basically threaten the ability to sustain life on the planet. And they've specifically identified three thresholds that we've already surpassed, the one involving the nitrogen cycle, the one involving climate change, and also the one involving biodiversity loss. And if you think about this, and as this is the current status, we can also sort of overlay the fact that agriculture has a large impact globally on each one of these cycles. And so the question then becomes, is how do we begin to match the need to produce more food and produce food to sustain the communities and the livelihoods of the planet at the same time with maintaining the life-supporting services found are necessary for life on Earth. And so if you think about the historical trajectory of agricultural production, sort of up here, we started with high levels of natural resources but low levels of food production. And over time, we've sort of traversed down along this line where we adopted sort of green revolution technologies, increasing inputs, largely to the detriment of the environment, ignoring some of the consequences and capitalizing on sort of the environmental capital. That brings us to then we've sort of undergone a little bit of an environmental awareness and awakening most recently, and we get to a point today where we're really at a crossroads, where we have to decide what is the type of future that we want to be a part of. And we can choose any number of various scenarios. We can go into an area where agriculture can actually contribute to preserving natural resources, or we can go into the opposite direction, where agriculture may actually, where we can ignore the signals and agriculture will actually continue to degrade the soil, to continue to degrade air resources, and to continue to degrade water resources. And so what do you see after you see these kinds of, when you start to think about this specifically in terms of agriculture and climate, you often see pictures and tables that look like this, where you see these aggregate examples of potential mitigation solutions and a lot of pluses and minuses. And a lot of pluses and minuses and uncertainty throughout with what are the possible effects these particular practices have on the potential to mitigate climate change. And from this, you have to, begets the question, this level of uncertainty begets the question, but what do we really know about agriculture and its effect on greenhouse gas emissions and removals, and specifically in smallholder systems? And just present one quick example here, where this is the ongoing meta-analysis about nitrous oxide emissions from managed soils in sub-Saharan Africa. There's less than 20 studies currently out there across all of the subcontinent. So essentially, we have virtually no data to judge what emissions are from these systems. If you couple that with the fact that major development projects are looking to increase the amount of nitrogen fertilizer applied, one of the nitrogen fertilizer being one of the catalysts of nitrous oxide emissions, up to 5-fold, you can think that there might actually be significant consequences on the amount of nitrous oxide released into the atmosphere. However, if you do a quick back of the envelope calculation, you can see that the radical change in the increase in nitrogen fertilizer applied would equate, based on the aerial unit of cropland in Africa and the recommended rates that development programs are suggesting, to about an increase in the amount of reactive nitrogen in the biosphere by 10 teragrams per year. If you think about the total, this in the frame of the total modification of the total human modification of the nitrogen cycle at this time, you basically, that's approximately 5%. So if you think back to the planetary boundaries slide, we are already potentially disturbing environmental systems that are already beyond what people think is a sustainable threshold already. That's not to argue or to suggest that smallholders in Africa should not apply nitrogen fertilizer, because it's clearly not the case. The point I'm simply trying to make is that at this point, we have no information to be able to evaluate what the trade-offs or synergies might be from some of these development actions. And we also can understand and see that when we utilize information that's been developed in other locations, we often provide erroneous results. These data are from a colleague in Western Kenya, where they applied readily available allometric equations. So these are equations that are looking at easy to measure proxies, such as diameter or breast height, to estimate above ground biomass. And he was interested specifically in trees on farm. And what he found is that if you apply readily available allometric equations to these systems in Western Kenya, you see at minimum or as much as a 13% underestimation of the biomass that's available in the landscape. This also, when you think about entire systems, the same type of errors propagate. This is some work by Merrill, our moderator, it's now in prep, where we were trying to look at the ability for the Cool Farm tool, so common greenhouse gas calculators that are based on methods and tools that have been largely calibrated based on data in temperate areas in developed countries, and their ability to predict greenhouse gas emissions. And basically what we see is that for a range of emissions from China to sub-Saharan Africa, we see a systematic bias and over-prediction by the tools for the emissions when you compare it to measured data. And what this suggests, when you look at the three examples, is that really there's no data. But then the real question is, does this really matter that there's no data? And I would make the argument that it actually does. And that's for three reasons. The first reason is that there, as you saw in the table, there's a long list of potential mitigation practices available. And so by not having any information on specific mitigation opportunities, we basically are enabled to help calibrate development programs, governments, to promote low emissions development solutions. So when you can choose from a whole slew of different practices, without information, they're basically guessing about which practices are appropriate for their specific location. Secondly, with the uncertainty that underlies all of the practices and all of the emissions and removals, we also we think that it constrains the ability for smallholders to capitalize on the emerging green economy. So without information on agricultural emissions and removal, there will be no way for smallholders to enter into any sort of carbon debate. And lastly, we think that because developing countries are primarily focused on agricultural, their economies are primarily focused on agricultural sectors, without any information, we think, on these sectors and their emissions and removals, we think that it actually weakens their position in global climate negotiations. So we're going to presume that there is actually a need for new data, and because of that, we created the samples program, which is what I'll be talking about the rest of the time. And this is the type of challenge that you see when you go into smallholder systems. And there's a reason, and some reasons why people have sort of steered away from doing measurements and quantifying emissions and removals in these systems. And that's because it's difficult. You have, even in smallholder farms and landscapes, you have a bunch of sources and sinks where you have carbon sequestration in pasture and wood, you have food crops, you have multiple livelihood strategies, you have food crops, you have cash crops, and so you have quite a number of objectives that are sometimes synergistic and sometimes may yield trade-offs as well. And so samples created 4 primary activities to try to build the infrastructure and pilot an approach to begin to quantify emissions at multiple spatial scales in these complex and diversified landscapes and farms. And basically, these are our 4 primary activities. We are trying to set up standardized measurement guidelines for complex systems. We are also trying to identify and organize ways of highlighting and targeting priority mitigation opportunities in a global mapping and regional mapping exercise. We are also building capacity in the region, both scientific and institutional. And then these first 3 activities really build the underlying infrastructure of a global network. And then with this infrastructure, we then are starting to build and analyze different fields, farms, and landscapes in an integrated assessment manner. So let's start with the first activity, which is about measurement guidelines. And it's important to understand that not all greenhouse gas numbers are equally credible. That the ways that people measure greenhouse gases, the methods that are used, can have a dramatic influence on the results. And let's just take this one example. This is about the use of static chambers to measure soil fluxes. So here is a static chamber. Basically what it is a glorified box that people put onto the soil, and they let greenhouse gases build up over time, and then they measure the concentration of gas and look at the rate of change. And so what we know over 30 years of research is that any number of characteristics of that box can affect and have an artifact on your measurement strategy. These authors looked at 360 studies that were available at the time, specifically of nitrous oxide fluxes. And what they found that over 60% of the studies either presented inadequate amounts of information or were rated poor or very poor, basically leading to them to discredit the ability, or leading them not necessarily to discredit the results, but to not have enough ability to have confidence in the results. So this was in 2008, so basically 50% of the information that we had on nitrous oxide was potentially compromised. However, the story isn't all bad. They also note that over time, the more recent studies actually take many more of these factors into account. So there is a feedback in the research cycle. So because of these types of issues, you see that there's been an explosion of protocols. And here's just a few select ones. And so if you think back to the picture that I showed with all the greenhouse gas sources and sinks, you can see that there's protocols for every single one of them. There's protocols for feed and enteric fermentation. There's protocols for soil fluxes. There's protocols for biomass. And every lab has one, every research group has one, every research network, and they're all doing different things, all slightly different. And so what we're trying to attempt to do in samples is to unify and come to a scientific consensus about the various protocols by doing comparative analyses. So we've gotten more than 40 scientists together to try to unify and come to a solid consensus about what the best approach is, specifically tailored for complex systems, specifically tailored for the research environment that we're facing in developing countries. But we're not always able to just utilize the methods that are already out there. There are unique constraints that we sometimes have to face. And I'll give you one quick example of some early work that we've done. And here we're again looking at research constraints that, on soil emissions and measuring soil emissions. And what we see is that there's a lot of small-scale spatial heterogeneity. And so when people put those boxes out on the soil, they generally put multiple boxes and measure at one over a course of time, and then take a mean to get a representative flux from this particular land use. At the same time, I also have said a couple times that we have limited institutional capacity and limited analytical capacity in some of our labs. And so when faced with these two challenges, we had to try to come up with ways that we could both maximize our ability to take as many samples as possible and greatly increase the amount of information that is available, at the same time as accounting for this sort of small-scale spatial heterogeneity that were available. And so what we did is scientists throughout samples came up with a gas pooling approach. So this is analogous to what people have been doing in soil sampling for 100 years when they take composite samples. When they want to know the average of soil chemical properties over a given land use, they measure at a bunch of different places, or sample at a bunch of different places, put them all in one bucket, mix it together, and then take a composite sample back to the lab. And so we did that same thing with gases. So at each time point that people are taking samples from a chamber, you take just a little bit of gas, we use 10 ml, and then you mix the gases from the individual chambers in the syringe. And what we found, and so what this does is it means that we reduced the number of samples, if you say that we had 5 chambers on an individual land use, from 20 to 4, essentially reducing the analytical time in our lab by 75%. And what you see is essentially that we get good agreement between the average flux, calculated by conventional methods, and the pooled sample. So the pooled sample are these red circles, and the average flux, you can't see it, are these black squares behind it. And we tested this across a range of different land uses, and we get relatively good results across both carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. And so so from the comparative analyses and our sort of new methods, we're coming up with this protocol, and really it's guidelines, not necessarily a protocol per se, that has a few specific methodological innovations. And really this will come out as an edited volume in 2014, but ultimately what we're trying to do is be smallholder centric, really deal with the issues that smallholders are facing. First and foremost, that means that people that are part of the samples network not only are interested in greenhouse gas emissions, they are also interested in productivity impacts and potentially economic impacts as well. So all of the greenhouse gas numbers are linked to productivity, and we expect the scientists to measure these as well. We are also interested in methods to look at multiple spatial scales. So, and the reason why we're interested in scales higher than the field is because ultimately that is where decisions are being made. The farmer in these smallholder areas are making decisions not only at their individual farming activity, but also across their entire farm. So we want to be able to aggregate and say something about changes in entire farming systems. And then also because researchers have a variety of budgetary constraints, we want to make sure that we provide robust methods across a range of costs. So obviously there's always a trade-off against cost, scale, and accuracy. However, we want to take this explicitly into account when we are making recommendations about specific methods of measurement. And so I'll move on to our second activity, which, if you recall, was really about mapping hotspots of mitigation opportunities. And I'll be very brief, only one slide about this. And essentially, we're taking a layered approach, where we're layering and mapping biophysical and socioeconomic parameters. You can see many of the types of ones that we're listing here to try to identify where the potential hotspots of greenhouse gas emissions and vulnerable populations are, where in this activity really we hope will identify priority research actions and priority development actions as well. These hotspots can then be overlaid with either currently existing information on mitigation options or newly generated information to provide what we would call leverage points. So these are areas where we might have really high bang for the buck in terms of mitigation potential, and specifically pro-poor mitigation potential. And so the third activity that we're working with is really about capacity building. And with this, we recognize that in many of the locations that we're working, there's very limited capacity, both in terms of the laboratory facilities and in terms of the scientific capacity to undertake this type of research. And so we're working with national ag research partners and universities to upgrade labs and to establish new labs and to be able to provide the fundamental basic infrastructure that's necessary to carry out this research. In addition, we're doing a lot of scientific capacity building, and we really look at scientific capacity through three different mechanisms. The first mechanisms, we hold regional and global short courses specifically about methods on quantification, data analysis, and such. And then we also do longer-term capacity building where we have master's and PhD students that are working with most of the sample scientists. And then, of course, as Meryl suggested, we also are heavily involved in the Climate, Food, and Farming Network. And so I would recommend that any developing country student, PhD students out there that are watching us online, look for the call next year so you can become a part of this network as well. And so you see, this is a global research network that we're essentially promoting and giving out grants for medium-term scientific stays and training in CGIAR centers globally. And this is the global distribution of CLIF network recipients over the last couple of years. And you can see we are working across many of the tropical developing countries. So I'll spend the rest of my time sort of talking about how we actually quantify emissions and what are our goals. And so we really have two goals when we're talking about quantifying emissions in this context. The first one is about sort of getting baseline information about emissions at landscape scales. And the second one is really about identifying specific mitigation options. And I'll start with the landscape emissions. And so this is a typical sort of complex landscape that you see. This is the Eastern Arc Mountains of Tanzania. And what you see is essentially that the landscape is often in transition. There are recently clearing areas. There's a lot of staple grains. There's some agroforestry species, and there's some sort of subsistence farming as well. And so how do you begin to think about deconstructing this complex landscape and farms into an actual unit that you can measure and quantify? And this is sort of our approach. We use a mixed method approach that involves everything from remote sensing to household surveys to deconstruct the landscape into functional units. Those functional units are then ground truth with household surveys and expert opinion to be able to identify what we call farm types and farming activities. What does this look like in practice? Is that it looks something like this. This is our Nyando site in Western Kenya, where we have overlaid some GIS analysis and remote sensing analysis to give sort of these major functional units based on land cover classifications and so forth. And then these dots are actually the household surveys where we've gone out and looked at other key characteristics that might be driving greenhouse gas emissions in these areas, such as management. And so after we do this type of analysis, ultimately what we get is we get target locations for quantifications, places where we know where we should measure. This area also provides us a scaling domain, both to go from our field and plot level measurements back up to larger aggregation. And so what kind of measurements do? We measure all of the sources and sinks that we've talked about. We use everything from remote sensing and biomass inventories, as well as soil emissions and soil carbon we do quite a bit of as well. But all of that is only a piece of what we do. We equally focus on livelihood transitions and livelihood indicators as well. And we do that through individual farmer household surveys as well as focus groups, as you can see up here. And what do we get from this type of analysis? Don't pay any attention to the numbers. They're just there for illustrative purposes. But we essentially have get a table where we can evaluate different farm and field types across a range of key indicators that relate to either the social acceptability of the particular practice, the economic and productivity returns of a particular practice, as well as the emissions intensity. And it gives us an idea of it gives us the information necessary both to do trade-off analysis and as well as to scale it back to larger spatial scales. So as I said, we also are quite interested in identifying mitigation options. And so I'll give you one example from our work in the Philippines and colleagues' work in the Philippines. And what they're investigating is the practice of alternate wetting and drying, so water management in paddy rice fields to reduce methane emissions. And this is a method where you essentially manage the water in the rice field to be within 15 centimeters of the soil surface. And a recent literature review basically suggests that you get a methane reduction of upwards of 43% and with this practice. However, we all know that these practices are just technologies and they don't always fit every given circumstance. And so our colleagues have taken the practice into farmers' fields and have them manage their fields themselves to see what type of effects that they get. And basically what they see, their setup of their experiment is that they went to 4 different districts or 4 different communities that have different access to different water, ranging from one district that has sufficient water all the time to the other extreme, which is water, it's forced alternate wetting and drying already, and they only have water available to them every other week. And then two other treatments sort of in between. And basically what they see is that they see dramatic reductions in methane emissions in the farmers' fields, in the communities, upwards of 77%. They also have nitrous oxide data. I'm just not showing it here. You do see a slight increase in nitrous oxide when with alternate wetting and drying, but it's not enough to offset the large decreases in methane. The other good part of this story is really that you see no differences in yield. And so with the continuous flooding in blue and the alternate wetting and drying in green, across all the sites, you see the fact that the yields basically remain the same. And so this alternate wetting drying in these areas of the Philippines immediately seems to sense that it might be a win-win, even across some of the social constraints of water management. And so what do these efforts really produce? And so what we're doing in samples is that we really go from these plus and minus and uncertain measurements that you see in many of these tables to actual quantities and ranges that can give you a sense of the actual effect that you might expect. And here are just a few of the various mitigation measures that are being investigated at various samples locations. And so together, our 4 activities essentially we hope will provide consistent and comparable data, priorities for research and targets for research and development, the human and institutional infrastructure that's necessary to carry out such work, and also will provide our proof of concept that there are socially available and place-based solutions that can both increase food security and mitigate climate change at the same time. However, our activities don't really stop there. A large piece of our work is also focused on how do we get our information back into the decision makers, back into people that can link our information with action. And so we work with a variety of development partners to try to increase the use of these particular practices that we've verified scientifically, that we've verified and can provide robust evidence for. We are also involved in national processes that are doing climate change adaptation and mitigation planning. And then also we are looking to try to couple our measurements, couple our information with nationally appropriate mitigation action development planning. So nationally appropriate mitigation actions being one of the key potential links between climate finance and smallholders in developing countries. And so what started with building infrastructure and 2 pilot sites is rapidly growing. And so in 2014, so in just next year, we will grow to be in 10 countries and have more than 15 sites, all utilizing similar methods to produce consistent and comparable data. And these are just a few of the examples of the types of activities that are ongoing in different sites. And with that, I'd like to thank our funding and our funding sources, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Todd. We'll now open it up for questions from the audience. And our online audience, there's still plenty of time to enter your questions, and we'll incorporate those into the discussion as well. For our live audience, when you're asking a question, please make sure that you speak into the microphone and hold it close to your mouth so that our online audience can hear your question as well. So any questions from the live audience today?
How much mechanisms do we need to do before we can just model these scenes?
So how much measurement do we actually need to do before we can just start modeling some of these processes?
Well, isn't that the million-dollar question? Basically, I think what we see is that because most of these models have been developed and calibrated for systems that are outside of the tropics, outside of these locations, we are unable to even judge the validity or evaluate them at this time. And so we at least need initial measurements to be able to evaluate models to see whether or not they may or may not reproduce the dynamics that we see in the field at this time. So at this point, it's almost impossible to judge an actual quantity of measurements that we would need, but we definitely need some, that's for sure.
Frederick?
Thank you so much, Dr. Todd, for whatever you presented. My question is, the target farmers, are they really willing to adopt mitigation if there's no immediate benefit for them? Thank you.
I think that in large part, many of the mitigation options that are being proposed and that are being tested have been co-developed with farmers and also have clear immediate benefits. Although the example that I gave was about alternate wetting and drying and the yields remained the same, there are other types of benefits that aren't necessarily captured in the yield number. So alternate wetting and drying decreases the amount of water demand. It often decreases labor as well. So there are benefits for them. They just may not be captured in this. So.
Maybe I just wanted to know, how does your assessment cover the issues of biodiversity, because that is a key thing to many farmers and where we are going forward? Because I didn't see that, at least.
Yeah. Currently, our assessment doesn't include biodiversity. It's specifically focused on climate regulation and food provisioning. So right now, it's outside of the scope of what we're working on. That being said, we generally, as a group, think about environmental impacts in general, and of which reductions in biodiversity due to agricultural expansion and intensification is on our radar and something that we would like to expand to in the future. But right now, the purview of our project is simply climate change mitigation and food production.
Saeed, and then Priyesh.
Thanks, Todd, for a nice presentation. I was just wondering, you mentioned something about landscape scale mitigation with assessment. So what is the importance of quantify greenhouse gas emission in landscape? Because it's such a big thing.
And so our thinking on the quantification of greenhouse gas emissions on landscapes is really about to try to organize and aggregate information to the scales of decision making. And so at landscape scales, you might see opportunities that arise that wouldn't necessarily arise at the farm scale, and that the people that are managing landscapes, communities and project developers for NAMAs and such, that might be the actual appropriate scale that they're interested in examining.
Yes.
Thanks, good for this presentation. I have an query. How much measurement do we need to do before we can just model these things?
So another question about modeling and what sort of...
How much measurement do we, or we can just model these things?
Yeah. Well, very similar to an earlier question, and basically we're faced with the situation where many people are promoting models, whether or not they be process-based, whether or not they be empirical, without adequate testing and validation and evaluation in the field. So my initial inclination would be that we need a lot of measurements in different systems that span agroecologies globally.
Let's take one question from the back, and then we have a question from the online audience.
Hi, I was wondering why you find it important to focus on small-scale farmers. That's the first question. And secondly, how do you demarcate? You talk about complex systems, but how do you demarcate between small-scale farmers and, well, larger-scale farms?
So the reason to focus on smallholder farmers is because we can't answer the fundamental question right now. There's not enough information about what their impacts on greenhouse gas emissions and removals even is. And so it may be that the outcome of our research is that they play a very small role and we shouldn't be focusing on them. The second reason to sort of focus on them and improve quantification of their systems is essentially if any sort of green economy ever does develop without a better quantification, then it'll be impossible for them to actually be involved in it. So one would be a scientific question about their overall relevance in global greenhouse gas budgets, and the second one would be a more economic and market-driven question. And then we don't necessarily, it depends on where the site is and where the systems are, because as you saw in my final slide, the systems will change and the size of the systems will change depending on what location you're at. So in the Philippines, we're talking generally very small farms, half a hectare or larger, while in some of the farms in Western Kenya can be upwards of 20 hectares, depending on which site we're actually at. So really, it depends on the researcher to understand the system, and when they're sort of deconstructing the landscape and the farms to sort of make that inclination themselves in decision.
We had a question from the online audience. Up here, up front. Misha.
Hi, I have two questions from the online audience. One is from Adam Gibbon, and he asks, how soon will tools data be available for projects that are currently underway? Will they be available in one freely accessible place? And the second question is from Daniel Backman. Regarding quantification methodologies and applicability across different climatic regions, how much research is necessary to make methodologies applicable for different agroecological zones?
Those are great questions.
So specifically speaking to the first question first about the availability of tools, data, and information, all of the information that's generated within samples will be available freely online through a couple different outlets. The first outlet in where the questioner can go would be the World Agroforestry website, the World Agroforestry Center's website, and if you search for the samples project, it will then bring you to a page that we will house all the links to all the different data products that we will be producing. The actual measurement guidelines themselves will be an open access book published by Springer in 2014. However, we plan to be posting drafts of the different chapters as early as January of next year. So everything, both within samples, but also more generally within CCAFs, is made publicly available, and data is made publicly available within 2 years. I'm not 100% sure that I get the second question, but what I think is being asked is, or can you repeat it actually? That would be great.
Regarding quantification methodologies and applicability across different climatic regions, how much research is necessary to make methodologies applicable for different agroecological zones?
Yeah. It's a tough question. You see quite a bit of variability caused by the underlying drivers of greenhouse gas emissions and consumption in different locations, and so the amount of research that's necessary is really dependent upon the systems of interest, and so it's almost an impossible question to answer and give any solid and response to. However, we have to start with one step. In many of these locations, we don't even have any numbers. And so we'll take baby steps and start with a few numbers, and then we can start to reduce the uncertainty that we have about specific emissions and go from there.
Ngoni?
Thank you, Todd. In your presentation, you mentioned that there are several protocols all over the place. Mm-hmm. And here you want to start another protocol, develop another protocol. Do we need another protocol at this stage?
This is a good question, and one that we grappled with for some time. And it's essentially why we decided not to reinvent the wheel and do comparative analysis of the existing protocols and adapt them specifically for smallholder contexts. And so not only will the output of that adaptation be available through the website and through the book published by Springer, we will also publish links to all the other protocols if you were interested that we know of. And if you know of protocols and you would like to send them, please send them to me, and we will add them to our sort of database so that people can make informed decisions about how they're making these measurements. Secondly, almost none of the protocols include anything about livelihoods. And so it's one of the very unique novelties of what we're trying to do, where we specifically link the measurements that we're doing to livelihoods. And the third real innovation is that most of the protocols are individuals based on individual sources. And so you either get a protocol about biomass quantification or you get a protocol about soil emissions and so forth. And so what we're attempting to do is to combine those all into a single house or under one umbrella so that you understand what the various sources and sinks are, and then you can make an informed decision about which ones you're going to measure and at what effort based on that.
Let's go right over here.
Thank you. My name is Lisa Andreasen. how do you make the linkage between the different scales? You're talking about farm level and landscape and regional, I think. But for instance, between farm level and landscape, how do you make the link between the testing and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so we use a variety of different approaches, or we're really testing a variety of different approaches, which is what the first year and a half of this project has really been about. So we use basically empirical models. So when we've decomposed the landscape into landscape units and farm types and field types, we then sort of have a relative scaling domain based on the activities that we are measuring. So we can go from the plot level measurements back up to higher levels because we have a sense of the frequency and distribution of those different landscape units at different scales. So that would be and that's fairly analogous to what you would see in sort of the IPCC guidelines. And additionally, we're using some process-based models and trying to test the utilization of process-based models, both on different land cover types and different management types, but also try to come up with some compound indices. So, but that sort of integrate across socioeconomic and biophysical parameters, so that we can start to try to move a little bit closer to. We're never going to the sort of biophysical and economic reality that we see in the field, because we're never going to be able to capture the heterogeneity both within system or between system. But potentially we can sort of categorize and cluster the systems, and so that we can start to sort of simplify against some of that heterogeneity. But so in short, it's basically empirical models and process-based models. We're also exploring ideas of, because some of the systems are crop livestock systems as well, of calibrating and building new models for this type of work.
Another question over here.
I've seen that you have two slides which tells about significant reduction of greenhouse gas emission, and at the meantime another slide which conveys message that even though there is reduction in water application, the yield is fairly constant. So if that is the case, on the basis of your study that you made in developing country, do you have any recommendations on the part of optimum water utilization to ensure unit reduction of greenhouse gas emissions? So that is one question, query. And the next one is to ensure that what is the cost of carbon dioxide abatement, and how the smallholder farmers can ensure that they have good return while reducing the unit reduction of carbon dioxide. So that is these are my two questions, I think.
Can you repeat the second question?
And the second question is, we know that there could be reduction in carbon dioxide due to changing practice of water management. So if that is the case, while changing the water management practice, there should be some changes in investment as well as in the operating costs. So what will be the return on the investment on the reduced carbon dioxide? How feasible it could be?
The opportunity cost of some of these.
And basically in developing world.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to give you probably what will amount to an unsatisfying answer, which is I'm happy to link you with the lead scientists that are doing the work in the Philippines. Basically, these samples is a distributed network of scientists doing individual studies, and so the specific levels of water that would have the greatest reduction, I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm happy to link you with those scientists who are currently doing that work. And it's not clear to me that it would be at a specific level of water versus as long as you keep it within 15 centimeters. And so it's I'm happy to give you their emails and link it.
Thank you. Zipporah?
Thanks a lot for that presentation. Actually, my question is somehow related to his questions. Because when you look like, for example, the IPCC report that came out, the role of developing countries in the emission chart was really very insignificant. take for example in Africa, the only emission that was indicated was only in the forest degradation, and that was only a small part in the rainforest. So my question is, does it really matter to the developing countries about emissions? I mean, is it what is all about? Because if you look at the emissions, it's really tiny portion, or does it really matter to them?
Two things. I think first, we have to be thinking about all the solutions and all the contributors to any sort of emissions. We will never get there if we single out individual actors, because it's the accumulation of all actors that are creating the overall problem. That being said, it's not necessarily the current level of emissions within agriculture and with smallholders that is most concerning. It's actually the trajectory of development that they are likely to be on or need to be on to be able to produce enough food that may be troubling. It may not be, but we don't know that, and so we can't talk to that right now with the data that we have.
One more question in the back along those lines.
If in those countries, if in developing countries, the policies are more focused on climate adaptation rather than mitigation, then what would be, because developing countries, I suppose most of the countries where you work see themselves as victims of climate change, then what would be the policy implications of your work?
Well, the most immediate policy implications of our work at the national scale is that you see countries and many countries that we work in that do have enabling environments for policy change on mitigation as well, which is why you saw in sort of that layered approach that I was presenting to priorities, one of the layers is actually about enabling environments for mitigation. I also would say that there are motivations and actions that people are moving towards nationally appropriate mitigation actions and the development of NAMAs, mostly with uncertain data, which basically means it'll be almost impossible because you can't link activities to actual emissions, which is really a key piece to being able to have a significant MRV for a NAMA. And so we at CCAFs and within samples, we completely agree that in most of the developing countries, adaptation is the highest priority, and mitigation comes along as a co-benefit of that. That being said, in general, most of the practices that we're advocating or testing, these have those dual benefits, or we expect them to have dual benefits of building soil carbon and so forth. And so we don't, it's really not an if or. I think that's sort of a false dichotomy that's often drawn partly because of policy reasons. And so it's we think that these things are actually much more closely tied together.
I think we had a question from our online audience.
Suzanne van Dijk asks, can you elaborate on your activities concerning silvopastoral systems? Is livestock production in silvopastoral systems part of your activities? That's the first question. And there's a question from Arjun Pandey that asks, isn't it more important to monitor greenhouse gas emissions from commercial farmers in developing countries and focus on climate change adaptation for smallholder farmers?
So on the first question about silvopastoral systems, in 2014 we will start to be looking at, our colleagues at CIAT in Colombia will lead projects on silvopastoral systems in 3 different countries, in Honduras, Nicaragua, and Colombia. So we haven't had any activities on silvopastoral systems yet. However, starting next year we will. In terms of the second question about adaptation versus mitigation, we believe that there is still a gap of information and knowledge about mitigation in developing countries, although we tend to agree that it is important to get better information and measured mitigation from commercial farms in developed countries. It is also important to have better information on mitigation and greenhouse gas emissions from developing country farms as well. I think the adaptation is quite closely aligned with the previous question and was answered in then.
I think at some point in your presentation, you mentioned something concerning sustainable threshold for greenhouse emission. I think there's conflicting definition of what that really is. What would you define that as is a sustainable threshold for greenhouse emission? And then how would you measure that to really make sure that it cuts across systems? Because that's a big challenge now.
So if I'm not mistaken, when I was referring to thresholds, I was really thinking about global thresholds about nonlinear responses in Earth systems. And so I'm not sure if that matches the scale that you're referring to, which I interpret to be really sort of a farming activity or a field or farm level in sustainable thresholds, in which case I wouldn't say that it's well defined what a sustainable threshold for emissions is at that level. So the sort of at the global level, people are talking about it in terms of major catastrophic changes that will affect life support systems. So at the level you're referring to, I think it's not defined at all.
We can maybe take a couple more questions before we wrap up. I think, did you have a question back here? Okay. Lars?
I was just wondering, do you have a strategy for scientific publications of all the data that you're generating in the various measurement areas? Or is it individual groups that is publishing the data, or do you have a common strategy of publication?
You mean trying to get together and put together special issues and so forth, or what do you mean by strategy?
Well, I just mean to make sure that these are also published in scientific journals, for example, so they get that quality stamp and can be used by the scientific community.
Yeah, it's a little, we don't necessarily have a unified strategy because it's mostly individual groups that are working on the specific problems, so that fall underneath the samples umbrella. But there is dedication and much talk about what the outputs are and when they will be coming along. So I'm confident that we'll have many publications from this work, but I'm equally as excited about the data side of this, and that's getting the data, the raw data, and other sort of data outputs out so that scientific community can use those, and the policy community can use those as well as the scientific publication.
Zipporah?
So as we talk right now, at what stage are you in developing this assessment that you are making up?
In which assessment? The guidelines or the...
Yes, with coming up with the guidelines, I mean, where are you now?
Where are they at right now?
So the guidelines are in various stages of completion, and depending on which chapter we're referring to, and some of them are completed, and some of them are about to go out for review. None of them are completed. Some of them are about to go for review, and some of them are just beginning. And so it depends on the chapter of interest.
One more back here.
Do you foresee a major role of agroforestry to build up soil carbon?
To build up soil carbon? I do work at the World Agroforestry Center, so what should I say? I foresee a role, but I don't see any individual mitigation activity playing a huge role. You know, I think we've now learned after 40 years of agricultural development that there's a lot of constraints that not only for agroforestry but for any type of change in farming practices, and so agroforestry will or has potential to play a role in increasing soil carbon, but we have to look to the whole range of activities and match those activities to the locations and to the social context of where we're trying to improve farming practices.
So maybe one more question before we close. We have one from the online audience.
Patrick Brandt asks, are there any efforts undertaken or planned on how to develop land use / landscape design scenarios under climate change?
So I'm going to interpret that question as that it's about planning and landscape planning. The other way I would potentially interpret it would be about protocols and measurement guidelines for land use change in developing countries. And so if I interpret it in the latter way, we are working on specifically on evaluating different measurement guidelines for land use change. If I interpret it the first way, where it's about land use planning, there's no current activities on that, but as we start to scale our results, we will be doing some scenario analysis, so we might be able, so that we can look at optimal landscape level management scenarios. And so that's one of the reasons why we want to look at multiple spatial scales.
All right, so that's all we have time for right now. Let's give our presenter a round of applause. Thank you very much, Todd, and thank you to our live and online audiences. We had some good debate about the role of smallholders in mitigation and also some great information about ongoing activities to fill some of those data gaps and allow for low emissions development planning. I hope you can join us again for our future seminars. You can find them on www.ccafs.org. So thank you very much.